Hello everyone, thanks for watching this video. This video is part of our whole church teaching where we're looking at the whole topic of a theology of suffering. I'm with Tim Murray.
Hello.
Here we are, and we have a board, an exciting board, because we're going to be exploring some worldviews on the whole topic of suffering. So often suffering can be a challenge or posed as a difficulty for Christianity. Someone might say, how can you be a Christian? How can you believe in God when there is so much suffering in the world? And this sometimes puts us on the defensive, and we sort of think that we have to try and prove how that fits, some of which you've been doing in the podcasts, but it sort of puts us in that position. But what we want to do today really is look at a different way of looking at this whole issue, because the reality is that suffering is a problem no matter what worldview you hold, whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian or you hold some other faith. So we're going to look at that using the board.
That's right. It's going to be one of our best videos ever because we've already done the grid, so we're well prepared.
We're looking forward to
it.
Yeah,
I mean, I've had people literally say to me before, how can you be a Christian? How can you believe in a good God?
Yeah.
When I watch the news and see whatever. And yeah, so we wanted to take the chance to say, actually, it's not just our problem.
Yeah, it's a whole world problem.
Yeah.
So Tim's going to do most of the sort of teaching. I'm going to jump in and ask questions and try and pose some difficult questions for you, Tim, and we'll take it from there. So do you want to just start by literally explaining what do we mean by worldview? What does that even mean?
Yeah, so we all have a good image to think of this is looking through the world at glasses. So if you're looking at the world out there, and you're looking through glasses, the glasses will shape what you see and how you see it. And a worldview is a bit like that. We all have a set of beliefs, a set of assumptions about what exists, what doesn't exist, what's true, what's not. And they shape the way that we understand the world. They're like the glasses we see through. And so, some people might say, for example, well, you've got beliefs because you're a Christian, but I don't believe in anything. And that's always a load of rubbish because we all have a set of beliefs. We all have a worldview that we use to make sense of things.
And then in the podcasts that you've done, you've talked about three things that really we need when we face or see suffering in the world. Yeah. What are those three things?
So this is back to the very first. I think we tend to need comfort. But the very first podcast talks that when we suffer, I think we tend to need comfort. We tend to need some way of making sense of what we're experiencing. And we tend to need hope. And what we're going to do in this video is go through some of the major worldview options and look at hope, comfort, and making sense, and kind of ask which worldviews can provide any of this, which can't.
Which is the best?
Yeah, which most adequately kind of is able to meet our needs when we suffer.
Great. So when we suffer, we need to make sense of it. Yeah. Do you want to put that one up?
I'll put that one up.
Great. So making sense of suffering. Secondly, we need...
There we go. Secondly, we need comfort.
Comfort.
So I'm not saying this is the order.
Yeah.
We normally need comfort before we make sense of anything.
Okay.
But yeah.
And thirdly,
we're going to need hope.
Wonderful. So, Tim, why don't you dive straight in? Where do you want to start?
Well, I think I want to start by saying that, we might feel that people have all kinds of beliefs. That, show me 100 people, I'll show you 100 different worldviews. But in reality, for some of the major questions of life, there's actually very few options. So to take the existence of God, for example, which is, probably the defining feature we're going to work through, either there is a spiritual world or there isn't. Do you know what I mean? On the existence of spiritual beings, there's only two worldviews in the end. There either is a spiritual world or there isn't a spiritual world. Whatever your beliefs are, you'll be in one of those two camps. So with God in particular, there is either, so if we take the view that there are no spiritual beings, we'll call that one materialism.
So there's only matter, there's only the material world that we know. and that we can discover and find out
Yeah,
about.
all that exists are physical, chemical
Okay.
properties, controlled by physical laws. There's no spiritual element to life, and therefore, this is often what people mean when they say atheism.
Yeah.
They often mean materialism. So
Okay.
that's our first one.
Yeah, that's a worldview. Yeah, can see that.
Okay, next one. The next one is polytheism. Okay, and this is a worldview. So theism is to do with there being a God, but poly means many. So polytheistic worldview is any worldview that says there are spiritual beings, there are gods, if you like, but there's not just one. There's more than one, the two or more. So to give you an example, this was the dominant worldview at the time the New Testament was written.
Okay, yeah.
So like the Greeks and the Romans, they would have believed there's loads of gods. And, for those, some people believe a kind of view of this where there's a sort of a good God and a bad God. So think of Star Wars.
Yeah.
You got the Force.
Okay.
But the Force is like, it's in and out of balance, isn't it? There's the good side of the Force and the bad side of the Force. And they're kind of warring.
Okay.
So
I was going to ask if you've got modern versions.
Yeah,
I wasn't imagining Star
Jedi.
Wars. So if you're a Jedi, then you're a polytheist.
Yeah, because there's in that worldview, there's a good force and a bad force, but like neither of them is a sort of supreme, or the only God. There's they're in conflict, and polytheism isn't a worldview that many of us would consciously hold today. And so what do you believe? I'm a polytheist. But it is the worldview of a lot of us who might describe ourselves as spiritual but not religious.
Okay, yeah.
Or
I can see
into, there's kind of good forces out there and bad forces out there, and we try and align
that.
ourselves.
So ideas
with
of
what we think is
fate,
good.
maybe, and things that sort of control your destiny, and there's good things sending you good ways and bad things pushing you bad ways.
Exactly.
Anything in that category sort of falls into this.
And for those in our church family who think that, that sounds a bit odd, it's actually like there's loads of people in our culture with that kind of worldview. It's a growing kind of spirituality in a loose sense, but really it's polytheism.
I can see that. Okay, so that's option number 2. So option number 3.
Option number 3 is pantheism.
Okay.
So again, to do with God, but pan means everything. And so pantheism is the worldview that says that there's no distinction between God and everything else that exists. So in pantheism, the world is God and God is the world. You and I are kind of embraced in the unity of God, and God is equally in us and in everything else. And this is a worldview that tends to come from the East.
Yeah.
So kind of Buddhism, Hinduism. Hinduism is more complicated than this, but often those worldviews lean in this direction, that really there's a kind of oneness that we're all part of. And our sort of sense of being separate from that is to do with our spiritual immaturity. And the kind of destination of our spiritual lives is to be ever more united into the God everything. Yeah. And again, if you think, well, no one in the UK believes that, do they, Tim? Actually, vast swathes of the New Age movement, this is their worldview. The New Age movement is all about cosmic consciousness, being united with the divine everything, and some forms of spiritualism as well. So again, pantheism is probably much more common than some of us might.
And as you said, some of these views are growing, aren't they, in our culture now?
And again, it's not that everyone who believes this will know they believe it.
Yeah.
If you said you're a pantheist, they might say, well, I've never heard that word before. But then they'll talk to you about being united with the divine in everything.
Yeah.
You're kind of dealing with pantheism.
Okay. And then option number 4.
Option number 4 is monotheism. So we believe in God, but mono, which means one. So only one God. So obviously we're Christians, and the monotheism that I'm going to defend in this video is Christianity, but Islam would be monotheistic as well, and Judaism would be monotheistic. That doesn't mean we're all the same. No. But in terms of these basic options, there's either one God, the maker of heaven and earth, if you like, there's everything is God, there's more than one God, or there's no God at all. And that is the sum total of options. There is no option beyond those four. Does that make sense?
So these are the broad categories.
Yeah.
Each of these break down into different streams and different beliefs, but these are the broad options of a worldview on God.
And it's monotheism that often gets attacked in terms of suffering, because we say there is one God, he created everything, he's all-powerful, and so would Islam and Judaism would say this, and he's good, but there's suffering. And people say, hold on a minute, if there's one all-powerful good God, suffering's a problem for you. Well, maybe it is, but as we'll hopefully see, every other option, I suggest, has more serious problems with suffering than monotheism.
Okay. I'm excited about this, Tim. We've got the board. We've set up the board now.
Yeah.
So let's see, where do you want to go first?
Yeah, where should we start? I'm tempted to start with probably the ones that are less familiar.
Okay.
And move through to materialism and atheism, because that's probably more. So I'm going to tease you and hold your concentration while we go through some of the others. So why don't we start with pantheism? Why don't we start with this kind of new agey, spiritually being united with everything approach to life? So, can this worldview make sense of suffering? Can it give us a way of understanding suffering, of finding meaning in it, purpose in it, and all of those sort of things? Well, the problem with this worldview, Tim, is if I am equally God as much as you are, and we're as equally God as much as this board is, and if in the end the goal is to be united in the oneness of everything, then it's very hard to have any meaningful concept of my separateness as a person, and my existence as a sort of a personality. Because if we are all united in the oneness, then is that your hand or is it my hand? It's kind of our hand. Do you see what I mean? And it's kind of God's hand. And if you pursue that way of thinking, then nothing really happens to me as me. It happens to us. To everything. So if you were to hit me, like, who's done wrong to who? Because we're not really separate.
All one.
We're all united into, or we're aiming to be united into the oneness. So in this worldview, in the end, like, any understanding of good and evil tends to disappear from view. So in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, which is a really influential pantheist text out of the kind of Buddhist Hindu, the kind of moment of revelation that comes to in the Bhagavad Gita is this sense of, we're one, my enemies and me are one, what's happened in the past, what happens in the future is one, and any sense of good and evil dissolves, and therefore any sense of wrong dissolves, any sense of justice dissolves, because there's no differentiation. In some senses, your experiences as a person dissolve. They're not yours, because there's not really a you. Because there's only really an us. Does that?
So, I think I'm with you. So is that saying then, so there isn't really good, there isn't really evil, it sort of just all melts into a oneness that exists?
Exactly. So in the end, there's no distinctions. And this is like, for this worldview, this isn't like an accident. This is the purpose, So if you become, if you pursue this course of spirituality, the aim will be to transcend any sense of personhood. And to be united in that everything. So I would argue then, can that make sense of suffering? Well, not really, because suffering only makes sense as something that we experience as persons. And, it would be meaningless to talk about a suffering I don't feel. But within this worldview, in the end, there is no I to feel anything. And I can't be treated unfairly because there's actually no right and wrongs in the end. In a way, it'd be me treating myself unfairly through the divine everything. So I sort of going to put a big cross.
So it doesn't make sense of our suffering because our suffering isn't really a thing to engage with. It's just part of the big melting pot of existence.
Exactly. So it's not unusual in these kind of texts and this kind of teaching for people to say things like, there is no good and evil, there is no pain and pleasure even.
Yeah.
You know, and the aim is to transcend that. So that takes us on to comfort, really. So is there comfort here? You know, maybe the idea, Tim, that you're suffering and I come to you and I say, look, Tim, you're part of the divine everything. You, rather than feeling this separate individual stuff, you need to transcend that and be united with the divine reality that is. In a way, I'm encouraging you to transcend your suffering, maybe to leave those feelings behind. So there is a sense of comfort there, maybe. But the price you pay is to transcend suffering. You have to just transcend yourself, your own personhood.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you only have any comfort for suffering if you stop being a person to be comforted in a way.
Okay. So you lose your identity, you lose who you are, and just melt again into this.
Exactly. And so suffering's gone, but so are you.
Yeah. And surely, does that not address the fact that you're in pain as well? Like, pain is quite a reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can say it's not, but when you're in pain, it's a very different story, isn't it?
So Francis Schaeffer once, Francis Schaeffer was a brilliant Christian. He spent many years working on worldview issues, and he had students come and stay with him and study. And he had a student with this kind of worldview and in the end, this probably paints a bad image of Schaeffer, but I think he stood above him with a kettle of boiling water, and he said, "There is no pain, there is no pleasure," and the student left the room. And of course, the point Schaeffer was making is, you can say you believe this, but none of us can live that.
Yeah.
Pain and pleasure can't be transcended like that.
With you.
So I guess I'm going to put here that there is maybe some comfort in suffering at a huge cost, which is the cost of being a person.
Yeah. Okay.
And therefore, more briefly, there's also, I guess, if there is any hope, it's the same story.
The hope in the big thing that we're all part of that makes sense, but individually as a person.
Yeah. So again, your only hope in suffering is to one day transcend away from it, but that is to lose your personhood.
Okay.
And of course, this worldview would say that, that is the experience of bliss. Again, I would argue you've got to be a person to experience anything. And a person must be separate in some way from other things that exist. So,
okay.
Yeah, does that deal with pantheism?
Pantheism, yeah. Where do you want to go next?
So let's take a step into polytheism then. So the idea that there's maybe more than one God.
Yeah.
Or certainly more than one spiritual force. Now, I think that this can make quite good sense of suffering, can't it? Like if there's an evil set of beings out there that are determined to cause suffering because they're evil, well,
it's their fault.
Yeah.
The reason that there's suffering is because there's evil beings there that are causing the problem.
It's like really logical, isn't it? It's like, I walk into my kid's bedroom. If it's untidy, it's a reasonable supposition it's untidy because they've made it messy.
Yeah. So there's something that's making the world a mess.
Exactly. Yeah. And polytheism has got a really easy explanation for this. Yeah, it's the sort of, and often, in polytheistic religions as they actually exist, this is often tied to like not keeping the gods happy enough.
Yeah.
So again, if you were Greek or Roman back in the day, and your house burnt down, you'd probably assume that you should have really made that sacrifice to Apollo that you didn't. Or, or another common theme is that it's when humans get above themselves. It's when they try to take too much power, become too proud. So sometimes polytheists can be really like devout, humble people because they're aware that there's a whole set of gods out there that might cause them to suffer if they don't behave well, So it makes a lot of sense. I think our problems with suffering kick in at this point.
Okay.
So if you're suffering because either you're being afflicted by dark spiritual forces or even worse, you haven't pulled your socks up and, you haven't behaved as you should and this is why you're suffering. What is your comfort in that. Like, it's probably your fault.
Yeah.
And even if it's not your fault, it's not something that you can change. Apart from, like, how would you ever change that? You'd need a stronger force for good to come and get rid of the forces that are causing you to suffer, right?
Yeah.
But in polytheism, we've got no guarantee that the good forces are stronger than the bad ones.
Who's the strong forces? Yeah.
Maybe the bad forces are the strong ones.
Yeah.
And to push it one step further, if kind of good and bad are equally balanced, like why do we call one good and one bad? How do we know which is good? Like maybe what we think of as evil might as well be kind of as right as what we think of as good, because there's no overall.
So maybe the Empire, to use your Star Wars, actually is the right way.
Yeah.
Because there's no greater thing that says that it's going against what is actually good.
And this is where, in a way, we come back to this.
Does it make sense?
And we say, it might be able to explain why I feel I experience suffering, but it can't tell me that that's wrong. It can't tell me that there's a problem with that. Maybe that's just the way it should be. I was
just going to say, maybe that's the way the world is, and we should just accept it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And so there's no comfort. And also, of course, then, how do you know the good side's going to win? Well, you've got no idea, because we're in a worldview where there is no guarantee of an ultimate triumph of good.
Does this also point in terms of hope to needing to offer greater and greater sort of? He talked about keeping the gods happy. You know, I know that sense of never quite feeling that you're there. You've never arrived because you've got to appease and give more and more and more and more. So that's I suppose a form of hope. Well, maybe if I offer a bit more, my house won't burn down next time.
Yeah.
But it's a false hope because you can never guarantee.
How do you ever know you've done enough?
Yeah.
And so we have people bound to a cycle of getting spiritualist readings.
Yeah.
And trying to offer the right prayers and trying to, some of us might feel ourselves slip into some of this, but in polytheism, it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
Like, you've got to keep doing your best to try and recruit the good forces to relieve you of suffering with absolutely no guarantee that you're going to be enough or that they're going to respond.
And we won't go there now because of time, but it's worth saying, isn't it, that we could look at the Romans or the Egyptians who hold a view like this and sort of easily see where it's at. But actually this thinking creeps into modern day thinking and even Christian thinking, doesn't it, at times? But we probably haven't got time to go there. So.
How do we keep God happy?
Yeah.
Yeah, the question we always ask, but we don't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where
do you want to go next?
So, well, we're going to land on Christianity because that's obviously the one I think is true.
Yeah, that's a good place.
But if we come to materialism now, and I think this is the one that, if there's any of you watching that aren't Christians, I guess you're more likely to hold this worldview than the other two I've talked about. Or they, with friends who aren't Christians, they'll either be agnostic and not really know what they believe, and you'll kind of have to work this out with them and say, I think this is what you believe. But if they have a strong sense of what they believe that isn't Christianity, it's probably this in our culture. In the end, I just think, we're physical bodies, atoms, chemistry is all there is. The great, the kind of new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, they're all this.
Okay.
Any sense of spirituality is just neurobiology.
Yeah.
Everything's reducible to what we can investigate by science.
All of our emotions or scent that we think is spirituality actually is chemicals in our brain that are firing off and giving us feelings and signals. Yeah,
exactly.
So it's all matter. Everything is matter.
And really importantly for this worldview then, what we have to see is that everything that exists now has only ever come from impersonal, material existence. Now, of course, this worldview has a big problem about, well, where did that come from? Yeah. But putting that to aside for a moment, say, you and I began in a bunch of random chemicals bumping around, behaving according to physical laws that eventually, through various processes, evolution and such like. But remember, these processes can't be they haven't got a direction. It's not like someone decided, this is the way things should unfold. For this worldview, there can never be purpose in development because
Yeah.
Purpose is something a person has, like,
Yeah.
you know, an atom can't have purpose in that sense. It's a personal function. So everything comes from that impersonal beginning. We are the random outcome from that starting point. Okay?
Yeah.
So, what does it mean to suffer then?
Okay.
Suffering might be something I feel I experience, and I might be able to describe accurately some of the physical processes that have led to that feeling. But a little bit like with pantheism, the main problem is, am I really a person that has any grasp of an experience? I'm just a bunch of chemicals configured in a random way through a long process that has had no purpose and no meaning and has no plan. So are you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going with you, almost with you. So
Yeah.
just before you go there, so it makes sense of suffering in the sense of things can go wrong.
Well, we have an experience of displeasure about something.
Okay. Yeah.
But again, things
So
can
things
go
can
wrong.
be broken, things can be malfunction, things can take a wrong course, or
But again, all of that assumes that we have knowledge of what is not broken, what is the right course. But I don't know in this worldview how you can ever claim that. Because so say, I was to chop off your arm. Well, I'm just a random bunch of chemicals doing what I have to do because I'm controlled by physical laws. Like, there's no mind at the bottom of this. There's no personhood. This in this worldview, it's very hard, almost impossible, I would argue, to avoid determinism, which is the belief that we don't ever actually make real choices. We might feel we do, but we don't.
Yeah.
Because we are just physical properties behaving according to physical laws. That's all we are. So it destroys your value.
Yeah.
Like, why are you even more valuable than the chair? You're both just a configuration of material properties. And if you were to say to me, but there's purpose to my existence, I'd say, well, is there?
Yeah.
You're just going to become the next set of chemicals contributing to the next set of physical laws, and there's no hand guiding this. We're just bumbling along, really. Anyway, so I would say, can it make sense of suffering? Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it can, because it can't really tell me that I'm a person. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It can't really tell me I have value. And if we're not people and we don't have value, then of what meaning is suffering?
What is suffering then anyway?
Like, suffering is just, again, another chemical process that the organism that is me experiences as a result of impersonal physical laws that are just working their way out and will work their way out.
Yeah.
My very belief, if I'm a materialist, my very belief that there is no spiritual existence is something I haven't chosen. It's just the determined outcome of physical. So in the end, people disappear. Meaning disappears. Value disappears. Unless we're more than just material properties, there's nothing to differentiate us from anything else. And therefore, I'm not sure we can make sense of suffering, really. And that's very theoretical, but take it on a personal level, Tim. If there's no God and no spiritual existence, and you have a chronic pain condition, and you say, my experience of life is absolutely terrible, how do I make sense of this? What meaning is there in this? What purpose is there in this? We'd say, well, you just drew a bit of bad luck in the roulette of life.
Yeah. Well, even luck, you're pushing into polytheism, aren't you, in that? So it's just the way it is.
It's just the way it is.
The world is just a bunch of random things, and that's just the way it happens.
So suicide is basically an increasingly logical option, because there is no meaning, Tim. It's just happened to you. If you don't like it, well, you're only a bunch of chemicals. You can end that experience.
So there's no sense that comes from that view.
And therefore, I think very little comfort. How can I be comforted in my suffering if I'm just a victim of a brutal universe that says to me, there's no one to care, really. even my experience of other people is like if they seem to care, it's only because they're kind of determined to do so as the particular organism that they are.
Yeah.
I realise that not everyone thinks in these
Yeah,
terms.
yeah. But it's helpful, I think, to drill down that far, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I think what we can sometimes do is say we're an atheist, but actually live out some of the other worldviews,
Absolutely. We say we're an atheist, but then we somehow think that one day everything's going to work out fine. You say, well, on what grounds would you believe that?
Yeah.
Well, I just got a vague hope.
Yeah.
Well, really, you're sort of a Christian in denial, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's what's going on. So I
no hope
struggle
comes
to
from
see
that.
that there's no comfort, there's no hope. I think some atheists would argue that, at least I don't have to say, if there is a spiritual being, they've abandoned me. But again, that feels like hope at a massive cost, doesn't it? So, at least I don't have to feel this is unfair. Well, yeah, I guess so. You don't have to feel it's unfair, but, you also have to make your peace with there being absolutely no validation that your suffering is wrong.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
And I think that's what's helpful with looking at the different views, because as we said right at the start, we often go for the defense as a Christian. But what I suppose you're looking at is, what do these views give you?
Yeah.
So not just how do you attack a view that's different to what you think you hold, but what does it actually, and what we're kind of saying is materialism doesn't actually give, when you suffer, it presents you with not really any sense to that suffering, no comfort and no hope in it. That's kind of what you're saying.
Say like that person that says, oh, I've watched the news, all these terrible things are happening. How can you believe in a good God when there's so much suffering? We probably wouldn't necessarily respond this argumentatively, but it'd be entirely appropriate to say, on what basis do you think that it's bad what's happening to them? Like, why do you think that they shouldn't suffer? Why do you think this is bad? You're assuming some version of the value of people, the goodness of creation, the kind of the human desire for pleasure. Well, you ain't going to find that in materialism. So, yes. Which brings us nicely to monotheism.
I was going to say, so where can we go?
So, in some ways, I've dealt with this in the podcast, haven't I? So I'm not going to go over all of this again. But in sort of summary terms, what our monotheism as Christians allows us to do is to make sense of suffering, because we say, suffering is a result of sin. It's very, like, we have a standard of goodness because God is good and he's infinite personal and he created all things, and all things that have their existence come from him. So we know what goodness is. We can know for sure what goodness is, which you cannot do in polytheism, you cannot do in materialism. So for a start, we have a good, and therefore we can suffer.
Yeah.
So we can only suffer because we know that there is a goodness and a pleasure that truly exists.
So suffering is a moving away or a brokenness or something that is not
from
good,
original good.
but original good. Whereas with the other views,
there's no original good.
So in materialism, there's definitely no. In polytheism, we're not sure which is good, which is right.
In pantheism, everything's the same. So again, distinctions between good and evil.
There's no good evil. Okay, yeah.
So you can only have suffering, essentially, when you've got good, and you can only have goodness when you start from something that's monotheistic, really.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we can explain suffering as a result of sin. And, again, this isn't the video for the theology of that, but sin is fundamentally a move away from the goodness of God.
Yeah.
It's something that's a result of God making us people who can choose and exercise choice, meaningful choice. But, the great theologians often talk about sin as negation. It's not really something in itself. It's a refusal of the goodness of God. So that's why we suffer. We suffer because we live in a world that is fallen, where we've chosen to sin, and therefore there's a brokenness and a not rightness.
And I just to highlight there, because we did do this in our other video around some of our wrong conceptions. You're not saying there that I'm suffering because of my personal sin. We're saying actually we know that there is suffering because there is this general sense. Sometimes it is because of our personal sin, but often it's because of the brokenness that sin has brought into the world.
So on a personal level, when you're suffering and you have the feeling of, this can't be right, I'm sure it wasn't meant to be like this, or this is deeply wrong, that's a Christian instinct to say, I wasn't made for this. you weren't made for that. We were made for goodness, and this is not good. That's a Christian instinct.
I think we need to press into that a little bit because, it'll lead on to comfort and hope, won't it? But that is, I deny anyone to feel that when you embrace, when you enter into suffering, or when you walk alongside someone who is seriously suffering. It just feels wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it feels like this should not be happening. This isn't the way it should be. And anyone who's been through suffering will know that. Yeah. It feels like that. Monotheism can explain what that feeling is, can't it?
Yeah, and validate it and say, yes, it shouldn't be like this.
Yeah.
And that immediately starts to bring comfort, because in some ways the first step to finding rightness is to have the wrongness acknowledged, isn't it? And say, this is, that's why as Christians, one of the first things we can say to suffering people is, I wish this wasn't the case, and I don't think it should be. Because that is our worldview, that God created us for good, not for evil. And I know, I've done all the podcasts about why it gets complicated, but it's so important, isn't it? And so,
do you think that's in some ways the beginning of comfort? I think it's not, obviously, if someone's going through intense suffering, it doesn't make it okay or doesn't make it right, but it begins to turn towards some kind of comfort in that mess.
Well, when you
heartbreak
suffer,
or hurt,
if someone was to come along and just say, come on then, let's get you out and about, let's try and cheer you up and try and help you practically. If they don't first say, I acknowledge your pain, it's not comforting, is it?
Yeah.
The first thing people need to say to us is, and we often find it hard to find words, don't we? Be like, I'm sorry for your loss, or I wish this wasn't the case for you, or I'm gutted for you. Like, we validate the pain, we agree it's wrong, it's evil, and then we have an and then.
And that's a stark contrast to materialism, which essentially says this doesn't matter.
Yeah,
it's
what it
irrelevant.
Is, yeah.
It's irrelevant in the big scheme of things. Which it isn't.
You don't have enough value. You don't have any value to make this important.
Okay, so then this turns to the and then.
Yeah, and then that kind of we sort of talked about comfort a bit. I think our worldview says that because God is good, the comfort is that He doesn't abandon us in our suffering, but that He has chosen to enter our suffering, to redeem us, but without squashing our individuality. So He doesn't become the pantheist God that says, I'm just going to unite you all into me and dissolve all that and you can transcend it all. He doesn't get rid of our personhood. He respects our personhood. He says, no, I created you people and I'm going to redeem you as people, but without denying your personhood and your freedom and all of that, I'm going to enter into your suffering and offer redemption. And that's the great comfort. And I talked on the podcast about the various ways that might play out. And it doesn't take away all the pain and all of that sort of thing. But ultimately, that's our comfort, is that God comes to us in our suffering to redeem us. He doesn't abandon us to it. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't ignore it. Yeah, when you look at the other options, you think, that's a significantly different worldview, really. And then that leads straight onto hope, doesn't it? That because, in polytheism, a good God might come towards us, mightn't he? And a good God might say, your suffering's evil and I want to come and help you with that. But there's no guarantee He's able to.
A bad God might jump in the way,
exactly,
push him out
a
the way.
stronger God. Whereas monotheism, our God's infinite, personal, and if He says one day I'm going to make all things new, He can deliver that.
Yeah.
And that as we trust Him, He can redeem all our suffering. That's our hope, is that He is good and able and strong enough to do that. So I hope the contrast is clear. And I hope you guys watching this, you may not naturally think in terms of worldview options. But I hope that you're prepared to kind of do the work on us with this, to wrestle with it, because sometimes we can miss just how different the Christian worldview is, and how, most of the time, if we feel that our beliefs aren't that different from other people's, it's because they're more Christian than they think they are.
Yeah. What application can we take from this into sort of our lives? So I think one is, you've talked about when we're discussing with others, we might not get the board out and do this, but at least we'll have a bit.
But we might. I'd love to see it.
Have a bit more of an idea. So I guess it gives us a confidence
I think
in our faith.
And the like willingness to ask back, I think, when people have those very natural conversations about how can you believe in a God when this has happened to me, to sort of in a very gentle way say, well, like what are your alternatives? What do you consider believing about this? And again, Francis Schaeffer used to say that you can say you believe something, but the proof of the pudding will be how you live. And I think to help people explore their beliefs and in a very gentle way say, like, do you really live like that? Do you know what I mean? If someone says to me, well, I believe there's no God and it's just people and they just do things, and to sort of try and draw out to them, well, does that give you any comfort?
Yeah.
What's your sense of hope? I think that's one application. But the other one sort of for us personally, I think, is when we suffer and we're tempted to turn away from God.
Yeah.
I understand it.
Yeah.
But I would also say it's worth asking the question, what are you going to turn to? What are you going to turn away? You can turn away from God, but what are you going to turn to? Because I'm not sure you're going to find comfort anywhere else, or hope anywhere else, or make sense of your comfort anywhere else, make sense of your suffering anywhere else. So sometimes that could be helpful, I think, for us to stick in with God. Say, I've got a lot of questions for you. I'm not happy about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling to believe in you today. But I kind of know there's a bit like John, the disciples in John's gospel, like, where else do we go?
Yeah.
Like, where else do we go with this?
And I think that's a nice place to sort of draw things to a close, because one of the things we've said in the theology of suffering is it's really important to get this work through before. Now, many of us would have faced suffering, but probably not the time to listen to the podcast is when you're personally facing intense suffering. But we need to work this through in preparation for suffering, which we will all do. We know that from experience. And maybe this in itself can get people to think, maybe we can think, actually, where will I turn when I face suffering?
Yeah.
Where will I turn? What will I turn to? Will I turn to some of these other views? Or I don't think we ever really turn to these views. I'm not sure we really do, but we think we are. Or actually, will we turn to God in that pain and in that suffering?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and therefore, maybe the final thing I say is, again, we don't have to fear. We don't have to fear the process of making sense of our suffering. We don't have to fear the hard questions, because even on this sort of fairly basic level, like, if God's true, he's true all the way down. If Jesus is true, it's true all the way down. He can cope with all the questions. Jesus said himself, like, the truth will set you free.
Yeah.
And we can pursue the truth. And we can look at other worldviews and say, well, what are the options?
Yeah.
It's fine to do that.
We've got to pick one.
We've got to pick. Yeah, you can't live outside of them.
Great.
And as Socrates, no, I won't finish with Socrates. We'll finish there. The unexamined life isn't worth living.
So, thanks for watching. Thanks, Tim. That's been really helpful. It's worth me just saying, if you want to comment below, maybe you disagree with some of this and you want to put comments on, you can do that below the video. I think you can do that, and we'll try and interact. Or you can get in touch with us, email us, and we'll continue the conversation.
But this does finish our whole church teaching on theology of suffering. This is the last bit. It will stay on the website forever, won't it, mate? So it's a resource that hopefully we can come back to again and again. And so no rush with it, as I take our time with this.